Hola estudiantes y bienvenidos a nuestra clase de hoy. Me llamo Señora Moss and this is Boot Verbs Explained. Today our learning target is I can explain how boot verbs work and I can form boot verb conjugations correctly. Our first step is going to be a short review lesson followed by a little bit of practice and then a little quiz at the end. Our first question has to be, what is a boot verb? A boot verb is a type of verb in Spanish that has an irregular conjugation. Irregular verbs exist because of a gradual change to a language over a long period of time. Irregular verbs exist in a lot of different languages. They exist in Spanish and French and English, in other languages as well. But today we're really going to be focused on one particular type of irregular verb that exists in Spanish. Boot verbs are a special kind of irregular verb. They're sometimes called radical or stem-changing verbs because they have a radical change that happens to the stem when you conjugate them. A radical change to the stem, so radical verbs or stem-changing verbs. Let's take this back 1 second, though. We need to first talk about all verbs in Spanish. So all verbs in Spanish have two parts. With pretty much every verb in Spanish, you can divide the verb up just like this. On the left-hand side, you have el raíz, and on the right-hand side, you have la terminación. Normally, when we conjugate verbs in Spanish, we don't worry about el raíz. We kind of leave it alone. When we conjugate regular verbs, we change the ending, la terminación, to go along with whoever is doing the action. So instead of saying yo hablar, we might say yo hablo, tú hablas, él habla, nosotros hablamos, vosotros habláis, or ellos hablan. And that's true of all regular verbs. We're going to conjugate them according to what the ending tells us it should be. If it's an AR verb, that's o, as, a, amos, ais, an. If it's an ER verb, that's o, es, e, emos, eis, en. And if it's an IR verb, it's o, es, e, imos, is, en. This is also true with boot verbs. Boot verbs can also be split into two parts, just like this. They still have el raíz y la terminación. Boot verbs have the same endings as regular verbs. They still have that o, as, a, amos, ais, an. They still have o, es, e, emos, eis, en, depending on if they are an ER, IR, or AR verb. However, they also get a change to the stem, which is why they're irregular. With a regular verb like hablar or correr, we're going to leave that stem alone. But with boot verbs, we have to also change something in the stem. When you conjugate a boot verb, there's two changes you have to make to that verb. You have to add the appropriate ending according to the subject of the sentence. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is you need to make a change to the stem of the verb. The change to the stem affects the main vowel of the stem, okay? They only affect one letter, and it's going to raise the sound of the higher to a higher vowel, all right? So when we look at the stem, for example, if I go back here to querer, volar, and pedir, it's going to be the vowel that's affected. So this E would be affected, this O would be affected, and this E would be affected. So there are three main types of boot verbs. These are grouped by the vowel that is affected and by the change that happens to that vowel. There are O to UE boot verbs, there are E to IE boot verbs, and there are E to I boot verbs. What happens with these is that we're going to replace the O with a UE sound. We'll replace an E with an IE sound, or we'll replace an E with an I. This is dependent on what kind of verb you're looking at. It varies a little bit. But for example, with volar, which means to fly, it's an O to UE, so the O would become UE. Most boot verbs fit into one of these three categories. There is one exception, which is jugar. Jugar is a U to UE stem-changing verb. It's really the only one you need to worry about. It's technically the only one that really exists in like common Spanish. So that is the only one that's like that. It's a little bit of an exception to the rule. With all of these verbs, you've replaced the vowel sound with a new vowel sound. For example, poder is an O to UE boot verb. We can see the O right here in the stem is what will get changed. So that O becomes a UE. So it goes from O to UE. When we conjugate poder, we'll make two changes. The first change is going to be to conjugate it normally. We're going to put the appropriate endings based on the subject of the sentence for an ER verb. The second change is going to be in the stem. One important thing to remember with these changes is that it only affects some of the subject forms. It will affect the yo, the tú, the él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes forms. It's never going to affect the nosotros or the vosotros forms. It just doesn't bother them. It just leaves them alone. I want to show you this verb chart. You can see I've color-coded this so that some of them stand out in pink, some of them are in blue. The yo, tú, él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes forms are the ones that are affected by the stem change. The nosotros and vosotros forms are not affected by the stem change, and those ones are in blue. These verbs are called boot verbs for a good reason. If I overlay this picture of a boot, you can see what I mean. You can see the yo, tú, él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes forms fit within that boot shape, right? However, the nosotros and the vosotros forms don't fit in the boot shape, so they're excluded from the stem change, just like they're excluded from the boot. They're just not part of the boot, so they don't get the boot verb change. Our steps are going to be like this. Number one, conjugate the verb normally, which just involves taking off the ending, la terminación, and putting on the appropriate ending depending on who's doing the action. So yo hablo, tú hablas, etc. Our second step is going to be to change the vowel in the stem. I want you to think of this as a two-step process because there is really two parts you need to worry about with these verbs. With regular verbs, it's really just one thing, but with the stem-changing verbs, it's two things to think about. So I really do want you to take it as a two-step process. This gets faster over time, it just takes practice, but when you're first starting out like this, it's really good to think of it like two parts. Let's take a look at the verb poder, which means to be able to. Poder is an O to UE stem-changing verb. Here's our little verb box. All right, we've got yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, and ellos, ellas, ustedes. I put the regular form of the verb here and the infinitive form just so you can see the thought process I want you to take. Now, when we look at poder, we can immediately see that it's an ER verb. So our ER endings are o, es, e, hemos, eis, and en. I want you guys to take a second and apply that concept. Apply those endings to these verbs. What would the ending for poder be? For the yo form, for example. What would the yo form of poder look like for just the ending? What would the el form of poder look like for the ending? What would the nosotros form look like? Okay, so let's take a look at it entirely. Our first step is to worry about those endings. So we have o, es, e, hemos, eis, en. But we know that's not where we need to finish this process. Now we need to look at our second step, which is to think about the stem. In this, we're going to take that O, the first O in the stem, and we're going to change it to a UE sound. Now take a second and look at this. Which forms are going to be affected? Which forms will not be affected? Your final verb chart is going to look like this. We've got puedo, puedes, puede, podemos, podéis, and pueden. These four that I've just circled exist in the boot, so they get the stem change. You see that UE has taken the place of the original O, but for podemos and podéis, they stay the same. Let's take a look at another verb. This verb is querer, which means to want. Querer is an E to IE stem-changing verb. Let's take our first step. We have querer here. What is the correct ending for the tú form? What is the correct ending for the ellos form? All right, so our endings would look like this. O, es, e, hemos, eis, en. This probably looks a little familiar to the last slide because these are both ER verbs. Now our next step is going to be to put in our stem change. When we put in our stem change, this is the E that we're worried about. It's the first E in querer, the E in the stem. This U is not going to be affected. We're only worried about the E here. Now remember, it's only going to affect the yo, tú, él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes form. So what would the yo form of querer be? What would the él form of querer be? All right, so let's take a look at the final chart. Our final chart is quiero, quieres, quiere, queremos, querréis, quieren. Again, we have the boot verbs kind of taking shape here. IE, 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 and IE, but it does not affect the nosotros or the vosotros form. In our last example here, this is pedir. Pedir is an E to IE stem changing verb, which means this E right here is going to become an I when the stem change happens. So let's take our first step. We're going to add our correct endings here. What is the correct ending for the nosotros form? What is the correct ending for the él form? Here are all the correct endings. Pero, pedes. So we have o, es, e, imos, is, en. This is an IR verb, so it looks a little bit different than the last one. Now let's go ahead and we're going to replace this E with an I because this is an E to IE stem changing verb. So what should your final version of the yo form look like? What should the final version of the ellos form look like? Here are all of your final forms. Pido, pides, pide, pedimos, pedis, piden. Forgot to highlight that one, sorry. Okay, so let's do some practice. Follow along, conjugate these verbs. Yo, querer. Juan, querer. Mis amigos y yo, pedir. Las chicas, poder. Tú, pedir. Yo, poder. And vosotros, querer. Okay, how did it go? Did you get all the answers correctly? Do you understand where you went wrong? If not, send me an email. Let's do a little bit more practice. This will be our last round. We're going to make it a little bit harder. Yo, volar. Volar is an O to UE stem changing verb. Juan y yo, preferir. Preferir is an E to IE stem changing verb. Vosotros, cerrar. Cerrar is an E to IE stem changing verb. Mi amigo, repetir. Mi amigo, repetir. Repetir is an E to I. Las chicas, contar. Contar is an O to UE stem changing verb. Tú, cerrar. Cerrar is an E to IE stem changing verb. It means to close. And then our last one, Julio, devolver. Julio, devolver. Devolver is an O to UE stem changing verb. Okay, so now that you've been through the practice, your next step is going to be to complete the Google form that's posted on Google Classroom for today. This is the same pre-assessment you took yesterday. I just want to see your score improve. So go ahead and take that little quiz, and then you'll be done for the day. All right, guys. Hasta luego. Adios. Buena suerte. Good luck.